For decades, Italy seemed easy to historians, to geneticists, to textbooks that like their stories clean. Italy was Rome, Rome was Europe, and Europe was already mapped. Or so everyone thought. The assumption was simple, almost comfortable. Modern Italians were believed to be the descendants of Romans, slightly blended with neighboring Europeans over time. A predictable mix: Latin roots, a dash of Germanic influence in the north, maybe a little Mediterranean flavor in the south. Nothing dramatic, nothing disruptive. In genetic terms, Italy was expected to be a solved puzzle, and for a long time, scientists did not question it. Early population genetics focused heavily on Northern and Western Europe, Britain, Scandinavia, Central Europe. These regions were easier to sample, easier to fund, and easier to fit into existing migration models. Italy, sitting neatly at the center of the Roman story, was treated as background, not a mystery. The Roman Empire itself reinforced the illusion. Rome unified language, law, roads, and identity so thoroughly that it felt logical to assume it unified blood as well. One empire, one people, one genetic signature stretching cleanly across the peninsula. So researchers grouped Italians together, averaged them out, and moved on. Southern Italy was often folded into vague Mediterranean categories, Northern Italy into Central Europe. The peninsula was flattened into a single line on a genetic chart, predictable, orderly, finished. But that confidence hit a problem. Most of these assumptions were built on limited samples, modern DNA only, and a heavy reliance on historical narratives rather than deep ancestry. Ancient genomes from Italy were scarce, regional differences were glossed over, and the Roman Empire, powerful as it was treated less like a crossroads and more like a genetic blender. No one stopped to ask a dangerous question. What if Rome did not erase what came before? What if Italy was not genetically unified, but layered? What if the peninsula had been absorbing people long before Latin was ever spoken? For decades, those questions stayed buried, not because they lacked importance, but because Italy looked too familiar to be suspicious. And that is exactly why the surprise was so profound. Because when scientists finally began looking deeper, region by region, genome by genome, Italy did not behave like a simple story at all. It behaved like a fault line. And once that line cracked open, nothing about Italian DNA looked predictable anymore. The moment scientists stopped averaging Italy, the illusion collapsed. Genome-wide studies did something simple but dangerous. They stopped treating Italians as one group and started looking at them region by region, village by village, coastline by coastline. And what emerged was not a population. It was a palimpsest. Instead of a single genetic signature, Italy revealed multiple ones, stacked on top of each other like archaeological layers pressed into the same land. Each layer told a different story. Each one belonged to a different time. Northern Italy began clustering with Central Europe, showing genetic signals linked to Alpine migrations and later continental movements. Central Italy reflected older Italic and Etruscan ancestries. Southern Italy pulled in a completely different direction, toward the Eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean, and the Near East. These were not minor variations, they were deep structural differences. Genetically, a person from Lombardy could be closer to someone from Austria than to someone from Calabria. A Sicilian genome could share affinities with Greece, or the Levant that barely appeared in the north at all. Italy was not one people with regional accents. It was several ancient populations occupying the same peninsula at different times, never fully replacing one another. This is where the archaeological metaphor becomes literal. Just as ancient cities were built atop older ruins, new populations settled on top of older ones without wiping them away. Instead of erasure, there was accumulation. Instead of replacement, there was layering. Bronze Age farmers, pre-Roman Italic tribes, Etruscans, Greek settlers, imperial era migrants, medieval movements. Each wave left DNA behind, and Rome, far from simplifying the picture, froze the layers in place. Its roads moved people. Its cities attracted outsiders. Its empire imported diversity faster than it could ever absorb it. Genome-wide data made something impossible to ignore. Italy had never been genetically unified. Not before Rome. Not during Rome. not after. The peninsula acted like a genetic sediment trap, collecting ancestry from every direction and preserving it, not blending it away, but storing it. And once scientists saw that pattern, a new realization followed, unsettling and unavoidable. If Italy was layered, then some layers had to be far older than the Roman world, older than Latin identity, older than the nation itself. And that meant the real story was no longer about Rome at all. It was about who arrived before it and who never truly left. The clearest crack in Italy's genetic story did not run east to west. It ran north to south. When scientists plotted Italian genomes against the rest of Europe, they expected a gradual transition, a smooth genetic slope from the Alps down to Sicily. That is how geography usually behaves. But Italy refused to cooperate. Northern Italians clustered tightly with Central Europeans. Genetically, regions like Lombardy, Veneto, and Piedmont leaned toward populations in Austria, Switzerland, and southern Germany. The signal was clean, consistent, and unmistakable. This made sense. At first, the Alps had never been a wall. They were a corridor. For millennia, people moved through mountain passes, bringing Bronze Age steppe ancestry, later Celtic influence, and medieval continental migrations into northern Italy. But as researchers moved south, the pattern broke. Central Italy began to drift away from Europe. Southern Italy broke from it entirely. Instead of clustering with the continent, southern Italians aligned with the eastern Mediterranean, Greece, the Aegean, Anatolia, the Levant. Genetic pull maps bent eastward, not north. This was not a faint signal. It was strong enough to surprise researchers who had spent their careers mapping European populations. Southern Italians were, in genetic terms, closer to people across the sea than to their own northern neighbors. The peninsula was behaving less like a bridge and more like a hinge. Two different genetic worlds met here, but they did not fully merge. They sat beside each other, separated by centuries of history compressed into a few hundred kilometers of land. This fracture was not created in modern times. It did not begin with national borders or medieval politics. It ran far deeper, tracing ancient sea routes, forgotten colonies, and long-distance contact that predated Rome itself. The Mediterranean, it turned out, was not a barrier. It was a highway, and southern Italy had always faced outward, toward ships, not mountains, toward exchange, not isolation. The genetic divide forced scientists to confront an uncomfortable truth. Italy was not pulled together by Rome. It had been pulled apart by its past. And the farther south they looked, the less European the story became, and the more Mediterranean, Eastern, and ancient it revealed itself to be. As scientists followed the fracture south, the data began to whisper something older than Rome, much older. Buried inside southern Italian genomes were signals that did not belong to Latin identity at all. They did not originate in the Roman Republic, the Empire, or even the early Italic tribes. These genetic threads pointed elsewhere, across water, across time, toward Greece, toward Anatolia, toward the ancient Levant. And they were not recent. Genome dating placed many of these signals thousands of years before Rome rose from the Tiber, before Latin became a language of power, before Italy was even a name. This was the moment scientists realized they were not looking at Roman expansion, they were looking at prehistory. Southern Italy, especially Sicily, Calabria, and Apulia, carried genetic signatures closely aligned with ancient Aegean and Near Eastern populations. These were not faint echoes left by traders passing through. They were deep, structural components of ancestry, meaning whole communities had arrived, settled, married, and stayed. The story textbooks told had been backward. Greek influence was supposed to be cultural, philosophy, art, temples, myths. But DNA does not lie politely. It showed that Magna Graecia was not just an idea carried by ships. It was people. Before Rome unified Italy by force, southern Italy had already been shaped by the eastern Mediterranean world. Greek-speaking settlers arrived in waves during the Bronze Age and early Iron Age, blending with local populations who themselves carried older Near Eastern ancestry from even earlier movements. And beneath that layer, something older still lingered. Anatolian and Levantine genetic signals hinted at migrations tied to the first farmers of the Mediterranean, populations that moved westward long before classical Greece existed. These people did not bring empires. They brought families, traditions, and DNA that rooted itself into southern Italian soil. By the time Rome expanded south, the population it encountered was already anciently mixed. Latin identity did not overwrite this ancestry. It inherited it, which means something profound. Southern Italy did not become Mediterranean because of Rome. Rome absorbed a Mediterranean south that already existed. The empire was not the beginning of Italy's diversity. It was late to it. And once that realization settled in, another question became impossible to avoid. If Greek and Near Eastern ancestry shaped the South so deeply, then how far did those connections really go? And who else had passed through these shores, leaving traces the empire never recorded? At first, scientists tried to explain it away. Trade, they said. Roman shipping routes. Merchants crossing the Mediterranean, leaving faint genetic traces behind. It sounded reasonable until the data refused to cooperate. Because the Near Eastern and North African ancestry showing up in southern Italy was not faint. It was not occasional. And it was not recent. It was deep. Genome-wide analysis revealed substantial genetic input from populations linked to the Levant and North Africa, especially in Sicily and the southern mainland. And these signals did not cluster around the Roman imperial period when trade was at its peak. Many of them predated it. Some stretched back into the Bronze Age. Others hinted at even older contact, long before Rome controlled the sea, long before its ports dominated Mediterranean exchange. This was not the genetic footprint of merchants passing through. Merchants leave light traces. This looked like settlement. Entire groups had crossed the Mediterranean and stayed. They married locally. Their descendants did not vanish. Their DNA endured, quietly, generation after generation. North Africa, often treated as a distant periphery in European narratives, suddenly appeared woven into the biological fabric of southern Italy. Not as an external influence, but as a contributor. This forced a reckoning. If Rome was not responsible, then who was? The Mediterranean had been busy long before Roman order. Phoenician sailors, Carthaginian traders, Bronze Age seafarers, whose names never made it into imperial records. People who moved not under banners, but under stars and winds. Southern Italy, sitting at the center of this sea, was never insulated from Africa or the Near East. It was exposed to them. And DNA proved that exposure was not one-directional. It was not brief. It was not erased. This ancestry did not sit on the surface of the genome. It was embedded. Which made one thing clear. Rome did not introduce diversity to southern Italy. Rome inherited it. And that realization broke something fundamental in the old model. Because if Near Eastern and North African ancestry had been present for millennia, then southern Italy was not a European edge. It was a Mediterranean core, a place where continents met, mixed, and stayed mixed, long before anyone thought to write it down. And if that was true, then the next question became inevitable.